So this presentation is a bit of an odd one for me because my expertise is actually in the business of killing weeds. So I am a weed scientist at Virginia Tech. I manage weed control issues and I conduct research to come up with weed control solutions in the areas of ornamental turf grass, as well as other managed types of turf, including industrial vegetation. And my connection to industrial vegetation, we're talking power lines and roadways and that sort of thing, railroads, has also led to a branch of research that my lab is currently doing in agroforestry. And so pine plantations, primarily in central Virginia. And so for, let's not date ourselves, but 40 years at least, I've been exposed to weeds, which are wild plants growing in an area that we don't want them to grow, but otherwise, all right, I just hit continue on a recording deal. Is everyone hearing me okay? Can you give me a thumbs up, Amber, or?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, good. All right, sorry, I had a little message over my screen. I didn't know if it was showing. Good to go. All right, so weeds are everywhere. I call it job security. And when you look at the primary weed issues that I deal with from day to day, again, mostly in ornamental turf grass settings, home lawns, golf courses, that sort of thing, most of them are actually plants that early American settlers have brought from the old world to the Americas. Now, why did they bring these plants? It's because these plants, which were once wild plants and our ancestors highly depended on them, had many uses. You could eat them, you could use them as medicine. So many of these valuable plants were brought from Europe to the Americas with the settlers, and they have become some of our most common weeds in ornamental settings. You know, something like dandelion is a perfect example of a highly desirable plant that is now the poster child of lawn weeds. If you wanted to make a subject matter about lawn weeds, most likely some stylized diagram of a dandelion would be an excellent graphic for you to use for that subject matter. It's that common. But dandelion is actually both a medicinal and mainly edible plant that has a number of uses, and we'll get into that. So this presentation came about because some colleagues of mine asked me to use my weed science knowledge and my close association with all of these troublesome plants, and to bring that into a presentation about edible plants. And I decided that we needed to be a little more robust than just edible plants as a use for these plants. So I have titled this presentation as Primitive Uses of Wild Plants, and it has become somewhat popular. I've given newspaper interviews and articles about this subject matter, and anyway, it's garnered a lot of attention. So let's get right into it. Now, when you think about wild plants and human association with wild plants, it goes back a long way. But in fact, in the last 100.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but did you switch slides? Oh,
yes, I just advanced to the next slide.
Okay, all right, good. I just wanted to make sure because you had like changed topics and we weren't seeing a different slide, so I wanted to make sure that it was working. Sorry, continue on.
Yeah, you should be seeing a slide of a bunch of quotes. John Muir, clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness is the top one. Is that what we have?
Yes.
Okay. So our association with plants goes back hundreds of thousands of years, but in the last 100 years or so, we have lost, for the most part, that knowledge, or at least it is not commonplace. It's not among the common citizenry. And so we have become quite disconnected from the forest where we once roamed and where we once were highly dependent upon. And you think about how long humans have been on the planet, or at least the genus Homo, how long we've been kicking around. It's about 400,000 years. And so that's a lot of time to gather a lot of knowledge about plants. And again, I would argue with the dawn of the pharmaceutical age, we have unfortunately lost a lot of that deep knowledge and history. We have fossil records that stem back 60,000 years ago that show how humans were collecting and storing various plants. For example, the medicinal plants, opium and cannabis, etc. We have fossil records that go back 60,000 years showing humans using those plants. And you can see the timeline that I've listed here. There's written record of medicinal plants that goes back almost 2,000 years, where the dawn of agriculture really started about 12,000 years ago. And you can move forward and you can see the steel plow was invented in 1837. And you think about how far we've come in terms of our agricultural technology and where that places us today. It places us in a situation of food security that our species has never known throughout its 400,000 years. In fact, our food security is so high at this time that most people, A, don't understand where their food comes from, and B, they have no idea of what it's like to even fathom the notion of going hungry, or seriously hungry. At least in the US, that is certainly the case. Now you'll notice in the middle of this timeline, I've got Nicholas Culpeper, his Complete Herbal, which was published in 1653. And I point that out because it kind of has bearing on a more modern entity that many of you might be familiar with. If you're familiar with the books of Harry Potter or the movies, J.K. Rowling actually extensively relied on Nicholas Culpeper's book from 1653 for the botanical references, of which there are many in that story, in the Harry Potter story. And it's quite interesting what she did, not only with Culpeper's work and the botanical descriptions and uses of some of the plants from the 1600s, but also what she did with the language of plants. In the 1800s, especially among the more elite society, there was actually a language of plants. Florists would be well versed in this today, but you could literally send a bouquet of plants and tell a story, and have a very complicated meaning based on the different plants that you're in. And J.K. Rowling used that association in her book. If you think about Lily, Harry Potter's mother, and her sister Petunia, if you look up the actual meanings of what Lily is supposed to signify and what Petunia is supposed to signify, you will see very clearly the characteristics of those two characters within the books. It's a perfect match for the stated definition or characteristics of Lily and Petunia in the plant language. And also, I find it interesting the first time, and I'm sorry for those of you who have not read Harry Potter, because these references are going to be very dull for you, so I'll get through this quickly. But the first time Severus Snape met Harry, now Snape, for those of you who are uninitiated, he was in love with Harry's mother, a very, very deep love, but she married someone else, and she later died, and he still is clinging to his love for her. But all he sees in her child, Harry, is Harry's father. And so there's an intense loathing there. But when Snape first met Harry, when he first went to school, he asked him a question about two plants. It was powdered root of asphodel and an infusion of wormwood. And he asked Harry, what would that make? You know, and Harry didn't know. And he was basically making fun of the kid in class. But it's very significant. Those two plants, when you look in the language of plants, basically they mean intense longing for Lily. And that was Harry's mother's name. So there's a lot of hidden things in the Harry Potter book that are that are based on this old botany. And Nicholas Culpepper's book, I would recommend you to maybe read some excerpts from it. You can get it for free online. It's really humorous, his writing style. Anyway, let me move on. So this slide is supposed to tell us that we went from an intense reliance on plants to a dawn of a more intensely agricultural-based and pharmaceutical-based world, where now we don't use wild plants for all of our medicinal and edible needs like we once did. All right, so I'm going to get into some plants that have uses and that people used a long time ago for either medicine or food. But I first want to stress how important identification is. Most people think, if you think about mushrooms and gathering mushrooms, there's this innate fear. Oh, you know, they're poisonous. The mushrooms are poisonous. There's a much higher percentage of poisonous plants than there are of poisonous mushrooms. If you think about the number of mushrooms that are out there and the number of plants that are out there, plants will win hands down. And in fact, most people think mushrooms are more poisonous. There are, in fact, plants that are more poisonous than any known mushroom. And I'll get into some of that as well. So identification is extremely important. A lot of people have died from eating the wrong plants. Now, this is a taxonomic key. Unfortunately, they're written by botanists for botanists, or they're basically written by taxonomists for taxonomists. They're going to be somewhat difficult for you to utilize in the field. You're probably going to get more use out of field guides, but bear in mind that you need to really pay attention to the characteristics of the plant to get the identification right. And if you are in doubt, do not consume anything that has not been identified by a trained professional, because the consequences, as I've indicated, can be deadly. Now, there are an estimated 400,000 plant species on Earth, and about 200,000 to 300,000 of those are at least partially consumable. So you got a 1 in 4 chance, or I'm sorry, you got a 3 in 4 chance of getting something to eat, a 1 in 4 chance of possibly dying. Now, out of those 400,000, or well, we'll say 300,000 plants that are at least partially consumable, how many of those do we eat? Surprisingly, worldwide, humans consume about 200 species out of that 300,000 species. And in fact, only 3 plant species account for over half of the global calories consumed from plants by humans. And those are corn, rice, and wheat. So I find that very interesting that there's so much floral diversity out there, and so much of it is edible, and yet, at least in the modern age, we know nothing of it. But first, let's talk about some poisonous plants. So I've got a short list. Now, aside from a few of these plants, and unfortunately monkshood or wolfsbane is one of them, most of the plants, 90% of the plants that I will talk about in this presentation, are adapted to Virginia. And when I give this presentation at Virginia Tech, I'm able to tell folks that within 5 miles of campus, you'd be able to find 90% of the plants that are in this presentation. And I would argue that's most likely going to be true anywhere in Virginia. Monkshood or wolfsbane is, well, for one, it's another question that Severus Snape asked Harry Potter. He asked him, what is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? So you now know there is no difference. Now, Hermione Granger had her hand in the air. She knew that there was no difference between them. Well, anyway, this one is a common ornamental in the U.S., but it's native to Europe. So, and it's not highly adapted and spread throughout the countryside here in Virginia. So you won't necessarily find this one outside of an ornamental bed. But it is extremely poisonous. You can actually take sap from this plant, or a tincture, which is soaking plant material in alcohol and then using the extract in that alcohol as a poison. You can lace darts with just a little bit of the sap from this plant and potentially kill people. In olden days, they call it wolfsbane because if they had an animal kill, let's say, for example, wolves came in the middle of the night and they killed one of your sheep. Well, the farmer can come out the next day and just sprinkle dried leaves of wolfsbane onto that carcass. And after the following night, the next morning, there will be 10 or 12 dead wolves laying around. I mean, we'll call it the old two-step. They can't even leave the site. This plant is extremely poisonous. There's actually one legal suit where it was believed by the plaintiffs that a gardener for a wealthy estate simply walked through a patch of this plant and collapsed, ended up hospitalized, and ultimately died. Now, that's somewhat contrary to most other poisonings or deaths related to this plant. It takes a little more exposure than just walking through a patch of them, but suffice it to say, it's very poisonous. All right, castor bean, which gives us castor oil. There is a manufacturing process in the creation of castor oil that removes the toxin. And so you can actually even consume a product of this plant, or you can use it as a motor lubricant. But ricin, which is the toxin in castor bean, is considered to be one of the most toxic organic substances on planet Earth. Even smoke from burning these plants can kill a human being. There is a very famous situation where a spy who spied on the Russians, his name was Georgy Markov, was actually killed by Russian agents, and they wanted the world to know that they did it. They used and this is like true spy movie type stuff. So this guy was trying to flee. He was in England, I think it was England. He was fleeing from the Russians. He was at a bus station, and someone, I assume a covert Russian agent, shot him with an umbrella, which was actually a small pellet gun, disguised as an umbrella. And inside this umbrella, this pellet gun, they had a titanium pellet that was bored out and filled with ricin, which is the toxin that comes from this particular plant. And the world watched this man die over about a week and a half. There was nothing the doctors could do. He was shot in the leg with a tiny microscopic pellet. I mean, the pellet was microscopic. You literally have to have a microscope to see it. And but it contained enough ricin to kill him. And there was nothing that the doctors could do. All right, closer to home. Well, I should say closer to home because this plant, although not native to Virginia, is widely adapted. You can find it up and down the roadways. You can find it in most pastures. This is poison hemlock, also a native of Europe, but very, very adapted to Virginia. You can find it almost anywhere. This one is the plant that was used to kill Socrates. He was sentenced to death, and back then, one of the ways that they did it was you had to drink a tea that was made from poison hemlock. And the last thing that Socrates said to his servant was, "Don't forget to pay this guy for this rooster that we owe him." And then he died. Jimson weed. Now this one is native, and it's all about Virginia. Even its name comes from Jamestown. So Jimson weed is it's a down the line rendition of Jamestown weed. It was shortened to Jimson weed. And the reason it was called Jamestown weed is because there was a number of military soldiers that in one instance, there's a recorded instance where these soldiers were marching from point A to point B. They came upon a big patch of Jimson weed and they said, hey, this stuff has big, pretty leaves, looks edible, let's chow down. So about 7 or 8 soldiers did. They ate large portions of the plant. Ironically, none of them died, but they went on a 4-day hallucinogenic high from consuming those leaves, where these men they stripped naked. At first, the other soldiers thought it was funny, but when they started eating their own feces and damaging, like bashing their head against rocks, they had to put them in chains. So there's a very riveting historical, actual document that was written down by the sergeant or whatever you want to call it that was in charge of these men, that detailed all the things that they were doing for 4 days under the influence of this plant. And of course, even today, this one ranks high in terms of poisonous plants because it is used as a recreational drug, and oftentimes these kids overdose and die. And there have been a number of fatal overdoses with Jimson weed. And that's the problem with, even if you're talking, in this case, we're talking about someone trying to make a recreational drug out of a wild plant. But whether it's a recreational drug or a medicine, it's hard to get the dosage correctly with wild plants, because from one leaf to another leaf on the same plant, the active ingredient can increase tenfold per unit leaf area. And then from one plant to the next in the same population, side by side, it may be another tenfold. So there you've got a 100-fold difference in active ingredient dosage per unit area of leaf or flower or seed or whatever it is that you're trying to extract. And so having all these wild genetics, it's not like the pharmaceutical industry where they know the active ingredient dosage in a batch or in a peel, or in crops where we breed and breed and breed and we eliminate the unnecessary genetics through breeding and come up with a very repeatable, every plant having the same amount of this or that. That's not the case in the wild. So you have to be careful with any type of plant used for drug or medicine. Oh, here's a good one. White snake root. Okay, this plant is hugely impactful on American colonization, and yet we Americans scarcely have ever heard of it. Abraham Lincoln's mother died from this plant, along with thousands, literally thousands of other early settlers that got what they called the trembles. And at the time, they thought it was a disease. They didn't know what was causing it. And again, very interesting information if you look up the history behind this plant. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that they finally proved that the trembles was coming from this plant. And in fact, there were some farmers that were so adamant that it was not the plant, and those people are crazy, it's got nothing to do with that plant, that they went and ate the thing and died. And so all of this is really well documented, but white snake root is a native plant that caused serious problems for early settlers because if you graze cattle in an area that had this plant, the cattle wouldn't eat it. But if you graze cattle in an area that had this plant and the cattle didn't have anything else to eat, they would eat it. And that's why there were so many people that were adamant it cannot be that weed, because my cows walk through that stuff and we got it everywhere. Why don't I have the sickness? But it was because if your cows have other forage, they would choose that first. It's only in droughty situations or scenarios where the cows have access to the weed and they don't have other things to eat. And when the cows eat the plant, if you then later consume the meat of the cow or the milk of the cow, you will die. And so a very interesting plant in early American colonization. Now this one, most people have heard of, common pokeweed. All right, so Phytolacca americana, it's also a native plant. And it's kind of funny because the Native American name for this plant I'm sorry, the Native American name that was often given to early white settlers was the people who eat this plant, because they thought it was ridiculous that anyone would try to eat common pokeweed, because you have to, it's all plant parts of this plant are toxic, and you have to boil it with exchanging the water multiple times to make it edible. The recommendation is 3 times. I've eaten enough of it, and I have, I've only done one water change while boiling the plant, and I'm still alive. It's fine. But the roots and the berries are among the more toxic portions. New leaves from young shoots are the least toxic. And so typically you would go and collect new shoots of the plant, boil them. Some people later fry them with bacon or something that actually tastes good, and then eat them. If there's no other flavoring in with it, collard greens taste way better than common pokeweed. I can find no endearing quality for common pokeweed, to tell you the truth. It's just a fibrous substance that can be flavored with something else. And so I don't recommend it. The biggest travesty, though, with this plant is the food that you would make from pokeweed came to be known as poke salad. Notice the spelling on that slide. Salad, S-A-L-L-E-T, not salad, as in the popular song, Poke Salad Annie. It never was, nor was it ever intended to be called salad. But since salad with a T sounds like salad, a lot of people associate this plant with, oh, I'll just go collect the leaves and eat it raw. Well, you're going to get you may not die from this when it's not quite that severe. Some people have, but what you typically get is severe stomach cramps from consuming this plant. No part of this plant can be consumed raw. It was never intended to be a salad. You have to boil and exchange the water to make it edible. All right, so a couple of house plants that have made my list of poisonous plants because they're the most common plants that cause harm or cause hospitalizations through ingestion, mainly from children. And that would be the dumb cane and philodendron. Both of these, the name dumb cane is because these things have a lot of calcium oxalate crystals that just macerate the inside of your mouth. And your mouth and throat will swell and restricting airflow. You can actually suffocate to death from fooling with this plant. But if you get it in your on your hands, if you get the sap, if you get it in your eyes, it's going to cause serious agitation as well as swelling. And this has happened to a number of people, causing hospitalizations in the U.S. All right, let's move into mind-altering plants. I've been adding too much. How much time do we have, Amber? I'm going to interrupt the presentation to ask this question because I can cater this to whatever you guys would like. But if we're on a timeline, I may need to speed up a bit.
Well, I didn't have a timeline necessarily. So for those of you who have to jump off, just know that this is being recorded. But Sean, whatever is, however fast or slow you want to make it is on you, because I've got it recorded so we can make it where we want to be.
All right, great. It usually goes about an hour, but that's with some demonstrations that I won't be doing tonight. So we'll probably come in around an hour and 10, 15 minutes or so. So I'll try to keep it at that.
All right, that sounds good. I do have a couple questions from the registration. When people signed up, I left a spot for them to ask questions. So I would like to at least address those at the end. If we have a couple minutes at the end. And of course, for everyone else who has questions, we can do that.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, we'll get those questions. And I'm wide open, so I've got all the time in the world. I just don't want to run long if you guys had something back to back or other plans. All right. So mind-altering plants is the next category. Now this is your recreational drug. This is, when I get to this section, that's when all the Virginia Tech students really get excited and start paying attention for the first time in class. So this is just a short list of plants that are most commonly used as recreational drugs. I really didn't, in my research, I didn't find any information about peyote. It's a cactus in the West. I think it's used kind of like marijuana, but I don't even know how it's consumed. Now, this one here, the second one, seer sage, Salvia divinorum. They also call it diviner's sage. This plant in some countries is protected the use of this plant is protected by law as a religious rite. There's a lot of people that have a religion that's centered around consuming or smoking, I guess, this plant, and then having hallucinations that are to them religious in nature. It became extremely globally popular because Miley Cyrus, the country singer's daughter and now singer, when she was 18 years old, she had a birthday party. It was filmed online, and she was taking hits from a bong. And at first, all the news media thought it was marijuana, but it was actually seer sage. And at that time, this plant was not regulated in the United States. So she was not doing anything illegal, but she came out and did a huge public apology over that because, just to all of her fan base, it didn't send the right message, that being released on the internet. Now, prickly lettuce. This one, out of all of the research that I did, I found the most interesting from the standpoint of not just mind altering, but potentially medicinal plant. You can find this plant in ornamental beds everywhere, abandoned places, roadsides, you name it. It's all over the place in Virginia. And it is actually an opiate replacement. There's a lot of testimonials online where people have utilized this plant to both overcome their opiate addiction, to stop using the stronger, more addictive opiates, and still manage insomnia, back pain, whatever their problem was. And again, like I said earlier, the big problem is how do you administer the dosage? So there's two primary ways that plants like this if they're going to be used medicinally, are used. One is through smoking the plant, and that's probably the best because you can, by the duration of the amount of time that you smoke, you add more and more active ingredient to your bloodstream. So you meter what you need, if you will, through duration of exposure. Another common method is to make to basically bash the plant into sap and then dry it and essentially make a fruit roll-up out of the plant sap. And then you can cut these little plant sap pieces, these little fruit roll-up pieces, into partitions that would be appropriate for a dosage. But the problem is from what plants, at what dosage was the plant originally. And there's really no, outside of having an analytical chemistry lab, there's no way to know what dosage is in your sap preparations. But anyway, that one was very interesting. Of course, marijuana, we don't really have to say much about that. I mean, everyone's heard of that. It's used for recreational. And then tobacco, same thing. I've already discussed Jimson weed, so that leaves us with morning glory. So morning glory is also a common agronomic weed, and I have conducted research on this plant, how to kill the plant, for years and years. And until I did my research into preparing for this presentation originally, I did not know that morning glory seed was a hallucinogen. And so there's a lot of, if you go on the internet, you can find what is called trip reports, TRIP, trip, like taking a trip. And it's basically where young people, mostly, will experiment with a new drug and then tell all their friends on the internet in a video format what they experienced. And I was able to get a lot of research information about some of these mind-altering plants through these online trip reports. And so the morning glory, for example, it tastes horrible apparently. And so you take like a handful of seed and you have to consume about that many. And they typically will do it with a Hershey's bar or something to cut the taste. And then supposedly you're going to be hit by about an hour to 2 hour severe stomach cramping. But once that's over with, then you can enjoy whatever the heck is these people are enjoying out of these hallucinogenic plants. And here's a couple of ornamental versions that you all might be familiar with. All of these, of course, poppy is no surprise, but coleus, mosaic plant, and ice plant are very well documented. There's, I read several scientific peer-reviewed research articles about what was the mind-altering substance involved and what concentration did each variety of the plant have, et cetera. So a lot of that stuff's been done in the scientific literature, but all of these have mind-altering properties to them. All right, moving on to plants that are edible. And remember, I mentioned dandelion. I've got that at the top of the list. And some of these weeds you all may be familiar with, broadleaf plantain, thistle. I'm going to go through kind of a line by line for a subset of these. We're not going to cover all of them, but this is a short list of plants. All of these you can find almost anywhere in Virginia. You should be able to find these within 10 miles of wherever you are in Virginia. So we'll start with wood sorrel. Now, as an edible plant, if you want to impress your friends, this is the one. All right. There's a lot of stuff in nature. All right. And you're going to read online. If you really want to get into eating plants, you're going to read online all these descriptions that make this stuff sound so good. Oh, you just want to run to the woods and find one and eat it. They're going to talk about this buttery, nutty flavor. And look, if you have eaten nacho cheese Doritos, there is nothing in the woods that's going to impress you. Nothing. I've eaten a number of these plants, and I can say that oxalis or wood sorrel is the best one we got. All right. So all plant parts of this plant are edible, and they all contain high concentrations of oxalic acid, hence the genus name oxalis. That oxalic acid will give you a tingling sensation, kind of like chewing on a sweet tart candy. And it's a very recognizable, immediate taste. And it's a favorable taste. It's really cool. And so if you want to impress your friends, find some oxalis, pluck it up, and eat it. It doesn't matter if it's the flower, the fruit, the leaves, you name it. Just try to avoid a plant that a dog has peed on, or that someone has sprayed with herbicide or some other pesticide, and you should be fine. Dandelion. My favorite preparation for dandelion is to make tea. All right, so you can take all above ground, well, above and below ground, it's easier with above ground to make tea, plant parts, leaves and flowers is what I'm talking about here. Dry them, crush them up, steep them in water, add a teaspoon of honey per cup, and it's awesome. Dandelion makes an excellent tea, but all plant parts are edible. You can saute the roots. You can eat any of it raw in a salad, including the flowers or leaves, and it's not bad. I mean, as an edible green goes, it's just fine in a salad. It's good. Broadleaf plantain. Now, what I'd say about this one is all plant parts are edible. They don't taste that good, to tell you the truth. The way I have typically used this plant personally is if I have a bee sting or a cut on my hand or some abrasion or an itchy spot, you can pluck up some broadleaf plantain, chew it for a little while, and then hold that, on your skin ailment as a poultice, and it helps to deaden the pain a little bit. Although for bee stings, I found tobacco juice or toothpaste to be more effective, but it does help. It helps with blood clotting, and it has antiseptic properties that prevent infection. So you can actually, a lot of people will make tinctures out of plantain. So basically you collect a bunch of leaves, put them in alcohol for like a month, and then you can take that material, that liquid, it'll be a green liquid at this point, you can take that out and rub it on your afflicted areas, and it's supposed to help with skin ailments. Garlic mustard. Now this one's it's an invasive species in certain areas. People are kind of in a tizzy about it, especially certain woodland areas, etc. So garlic mustard's a big invasive. But one of the interesting things that it can be used for as a flavoring, you can actually pack this stuff, whether it's minced or in wholly form, you can pack it all over meat that is going to be dried for later consumption, and it will impart a pretty strong garlic flavoring. I mean, if you're living in the woods and living off of only what the woods have to offer, finding something that has strong, pungent flavor like garlic mustard is a godsend, because most things are kind of tannic, bitter, and bland. And so garlic mustard will impart flavoring to, I wonder if I have colt's foot in here. If not, I'll go ahead and mention it now because it's a similar looking plant. Colt's foot, you can actually burn the leaves of colt's foot and save the ash, and it's a salt substitute. So it's a high mineral intensive plant, and the ashes of that plant will salt your food. Common blue violet. Now this one, again, the vegetation is edible, but it's bland, it's harsh. The coolest thing I can say about it is the flowers are consumable, and if you take a flower and you eat the stalk that is supporting the flower, the peduncle, the closer that peduncle gets to the flower, it becomes a sugar stick. Like, you will definitely notice the very sweet sensation that you'll get from eating the upper half of a wild violet peduncle, the flower stalk. But the rest of the plant tastes like crap. All right, ground ivy. Ground ivy is actually, in history, it's very common, or it was very common to use in place of what we now use hops for. It was it had a very pungent minty flavor, and it was used to preserve beer. And so it was brought over probably because of that very valuable use, and it has since escaped. But it does add a very pungent minty flavor to food as well, and it's also consumable. Let me make one comment about these plants, and I just thought about it thinking about oxalis. All of these plants are edible, true, but when in nature, you probably want to forage small amounts of many different things. You don't want to take and create an entire salad bowl that's 12-inch diameter and pile it 3 inches deep with nothing but oxalis leaves, wood soil I'm talking about, and then just consume all of that. You're probably going to get a stomach ache. There's probably enough oxalic acid to give you a stomach ache just in that. And so diversify. That should be the theme if you're doing any type of foraging for wild edibles. You need to diversify. Don't overconsume any one item. Okay, here is a short list of edible trees and shrubs. Most trees that produce fruit are edible. All of our conifers, all conifers are edible. You can eat the inner bark, which is probably the most, again, you can't eat too much of it, but it is full of nutrition that can keep you alive. So even in the wintertime, if you were to go shave off the outer bark and then get the cambium layer of a small portion, you wouldn't circumvent the tree, that'll kill the tree, but you just scrape a small area that it can later with sap repair, then that's food that can keep you alive in the wintertime. But also the needles of conifers, you can boil them and it's going to release minerals, and you kind of make a a pine tree tea. All of these things contain nutrition that throughout the year, in the case of winter, in times when there's not a whole lot of nutrition to be found roaming through the woods. Most trees you can make syrup from their sap. The reason we use maple predominantly is because it has a higher yield. Sycamore, for example, takes 100 liters of sap to create 1 liter of syrup, whereas maple would be more like 70 liters to 1. But they all have their own unique flavor. So if you make syrup out of black walnut, for example, that's going to taste different than sycamore, which is sycamore is much, much sweeter than maple or walnut. And so having syrup made from different trees, that's an interesting thing to do there. And then, of course, fruits from things like crabapple and seeds of pine trees. You can open up a pine cone, and those are pine nuts. They're better roasted over a fire, but you can eat them raw. And so acorns, for example, you can talk about tannic and bitter. They're consumable raw, but you're not going to like acorns unless they've been processed. And there's a number of ways to do that. I'll get into that in a moment. So here we're talking about, I mentioned eating the intercambium of conifer type trees. It's not just pine. I mean, we're talking spruce, hemlock, any of those. But that's kind of what that would look like. You would shave off that intercambium and you can just chew it right there. You can also smoke it over a fire and then consume it. The pollen is edible. All parts of those plants are edible. Here's an example of using pine pollen to create a flour type substance that you could then, in essence, bread your meat with or use for other purposes. I mentioned making syrup from different types of trees. And basically, you get a bunch of watery sap from the tree, boil it down, boil it down, boil it down. I mean, it takes literally 1 gallon of syrup will make you about an ounce of, 1 gallon of sap from, for example, a black walnut or a sycamore will make you about 1 ounce of syrup. So if you have about 5 gallons, you can make a pretty good jar of syrup. Just some example of tree fruit and nuts that we can find in Virginia. Multiflora rose or other rose hips are highly valued. Like if you're a vegetarian, you probably know about the vitamin content of rose hips. It's a high vitamin type plant that's going to give you nutrition that you wouldn't necessarily get from other plants. It's packed full of antioxidants, so anti-cancer agents. Roses have been cultivated for a long, long time, and they've been eaten for that amount of time too. So it's not just an ornamental plant. All right, here's an example of making flour out of wild plants. And in this case, so you see the list up there, things that one might make flour from: conifer bark, acorns, amaranth or chenopodium seed, sedge or grass seeds, and then the white pithy stem and root material of cattails. In fact, the cattail stem and root can be somewhat of a thickening agent for other types of flour to mix in, but the bread that you would make from these materials are not going to stand up to what you're accustomed to with our gluten-rich wheat that is predominantly used for that purpose. Grasses, that's another thing to mention. All grasses, all sedges, all rushes, they're all edible. So as a wild plant collection deal, going out with it can be a t-shirt, but any large pan, a large storage container, plastic container, and going through a marshy area where the grass is just, shoulder high and hanging over, and with a stick or just by grabbing the stems and beating those seed into your container or into your shirt or whatever it is you're using, you can gather in an hour, you can gather a gallon, you can gather a huge amount of sustenance. It's really high. The endosperm in those seed are very nutritious, full of carbohydrate. And then you can process those and add other flavoring agents to them because they're going to be pretty bland compared to what you're accustomed to. Besides, we put salt and all these other flavorings in our wheat as well when we make bread. But that's kind of a staple that would go along with other types of food, for example, that Native Americans would have eaten. And it can be the same if you want to forage for wild edibles to kind of fill out your meal. All right, so that brings us to the last couple of sections that I will mention under primitive uses of wild plants. And this one is on fire making. And this is a very popular demonstration that I typically do for this presentation is I bring a bow drill and a hand drill set, and I invite members of the audience to come and to see if they can get smoke, which most do because I have brought the right type of materials for them to experiment with. The type of wood that you use for this purpose is important. It takes an extremely skilled person to produce fire with just any old wood that they find. And even then, they are experienced in where to look and how to find dry material at any time of the year, etc. But I've got, a list there of what we might use to make spindles. So a bow drill, let me see if I've got another, no, I don't have any other pictures. So this guy in the bottom left, you can see the hands are doing something or making smoke. He's holding a bow. We can't see what's going on for the smoke involved there, but that bow, it looks like a miniature bow and arrow. It has a string that's double looped around that spindle, which is he's pressing down with his hand. And as you move that bow back and forth as if you were trying to saw down a tree with a bow saw, all right, you're using your bow drill, the string that's wrapped around really tightly on that spindle is making the spindle spin back and forth extremely rapidly. So you press your bow drill forward and the string winds around that spindle 8 or 10 times, making it spin rapidly, and then you pull it back and it spins just as rapidly in the opposite direction. And as fast as you can saw on that thing, you're producing that spindle to, it's the same thing that if you were using a hand drill, you'd be doing this, but you're wearing out your hands, you're producing calluses, and it's nowhere near the speed or ferocity with a hand drill that you can get from a bow drill. And I can, just looking at that image, couple of things. He's using a cloth to support his hand. Under that cloth, he most likely has a lubricated piece of wood or a lubricated piece of stone with an indentation. You can see one, the bottom right-hand corner. Notice that this stone has a huge hole. It's just cutting off the screen there. You would put your spindle into that hole in the stone. The stone is going to provide free gravity-induced downward pressure. And all you have to do is stabilize the stone in place, and you're sawing back and forth with your bow drill. One of the things that I demonstrate when I do this presentation live is I actually have authentic Native American tools. I have a bow drill stone that came from the Delta region of Mississippi. And anyway, I demonstrate this technique for folks. But if you use the right type of wood for your spindle and for your fireboard, the fireboard's the one that's got all those scarred pits in it. And then if you have a tinder bundle that's ready to go, cattail, for example, the little plumes that if you crack open a cattail, the plumes in a cattail are highly, I mean, they're like gasoline. You get the least little bit of ember or spark on that cattail and it's going to flame up. And so it's awesome for that. But broom sedge, that's listed because even in a reasonably wet environment, broom sedge that is fairly dry can always be found any time of year. And if you do gather broom sedge, even if it's wet, one night over a fire, at a distance, will dry it out so that it's going to be a very ready to go tinder if you need to start another fire. And so a lot of this primitive uses of plants, it was developed by hunter-gatherers. And when you saw material that you thought you might need in the future, you collected it. When you see material that's dry right now when it's sunny, you collect it and put it in an old bag so that it doesn't get wet. So tonight, when you are cold and you need a fire, you have that material on hand and ready to go. Here's an example of what the most common or some of the best plants that's used for bow or hand drill spindles. Common mullein, it's the center one, and it's one of the best. When the plant gets old and all the leaves have senesced, you'll have a dry stalk that will persist into the winter. You can collect that stalk, whittle it down with a pocket knife, and you can create really nice spindles. Oftentimes the spindle of the plant itself is too brittle to wrap the bowstring around. So what you do is you take a piece of cedar or any other soft wood and you carve out about a 10-inch long spindle, and you bore a hole in the bottom of it, and you insert your mullein shaft into the bottom of that cedar spindle. Then you can wrap your string around the cedar, put your stone on the cedar, and there's just a little 4-inch piece of mullein on the bottom that's producing, because mullein produces all three of these plants produce a really fine ignitable powder when they're ground against wood. Horseweed, even horseweed, of course, it's not strong enough for anything but hand spindles, but it makes a really good ignitable spindle. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is cordage, the making of rope and clothing, etc. And the two best plants are both native to the Americas, and that is yucca and hemp dogbane. Hemp dogbane is a tenacious weed. It's one that I have dealt with. It's resistant to herbicidal control, but it does infest naturalized areas, places where people don't want it. It infests gardens, roadsides, etc. But it makes fibers that are unbelievably strong and also unbelievably rot resistant. You can actually make fishing gear out of hemp dogbane cordage. Here's some examples of Native American made items. So the images here from left to right. So on the far left here is a purse. And so it's extremely durable. You know, hemp dogbane, the material, the fibers, once you spin them into thread and then weave that into stronger like rope, then you can weave that into items. You can make clothing out of hemp dogbane. So the one on the left is a purse. The one in the middle is actually that's the equivalent of a modern day fishing rod. And so you can make nets out of hemp dogbane. You can to catch fish with, and it can stay submerged in the water for weeks, if not months, and not rot. You can, and over here on the right is a sling, and you can even make bowstring. It's that strong. And one of the things that when I do this presentation live, I pass around some hemp dogbane cordage that I personally have made, and it's really small. It's about a 1/16 of an inch. If you can, it's even smaller than what that little hole in my fingers there. I'm trying to think of it's about 3 times the diameter of fishing line, and you know, no one in the audience can break it. It's extremely strong, so you can literally fish with cordage made from hemp dogbane. The way you would do it is you collect the plants in the fall to early winter, and then you allow the stems to dry completely. And you see the middle image shows a picture of a hemp dogbane stem with the leaves still attached. That red stem, you'll be crushing that and breaking the fibers away from that plant. And then you there's videos online to show how to do all this. But you roll those fibers on your knee. You wet them a little bit. You roll them on your knee, and then you take 3 small fiber strands and then weave those into one cord. And then you can take 3 of those and weave that into an even stronger cord. I've actually heard testimonials of people who got their vehicle stuck in the mud, like going out Jeep riding and you get stuck and you don't have any rope. I'm gonna back up a slide. Yucca, the plant on the left here, you can actually take those leaves, and green or dry, the fibers in them are so strong that you can fairly quickly weave together a rope that will pull a vehicle out of a ditch with yucca. There's people that within an hour's time had a very crude, you know, conglomeration of yucca leaves made into a rope that allowed another vehicle to pull them out of a ditch. So it's, and I would say if you had even more time and could weave a serious rope out of hemp dog bane, you could probably pull a bulldozer out of a ditch. So anyway, they're great material. Other materials of note, pretty much anything that produces strong fibers. Stinging nettle is a great example. Of course, you have to carefully scrape the stinging hairs off of the nettle before. Of course, it's edible as well, but it makes really good rope making fibers. Velvet leaf, Abutilon is the genus there. Milkweed, prairie flax, thistles, fireweed, and then of course stems of grapevine, greenbrier, hazelnut, and also think about the roots of conifers like hemlock. If you're in kind of an old forested area with the kind of the moss looking soil, if you scratch around in that soil, the surface roots of those hemlock trees, especially near a stream, are small, and you can find enough of those and they're very flexible. You can weave them into a very strong rope, or you can weave them into a basket that you can catch fish in, things like that. So there's a lot of things you can do with plant material that most people in modern times have never even thought about doing, much less done. So that concludes the presentation. And so let's get to some of those questions.